Shelves across Ontario are suddenly bare of American wines. The Wall Street Journal reports a 67% collapse in U.S. wine exports to Canada, worth roughly $173 million, while spirits plunged by 62% in just 6 months. For decades, Canadians poured billions into Napa Reds and Kentucky Bourbon. Now, entire pallets of American bottles sit abandoned in warehouses. This isn't just a tariff story, it's a boycott. The question is simple, but seismic. How did America's tariff war end up boomeranging back home? For years, the flow of alcohol across the 49th parallel seemed almost untouchable. Canadian consumers packed liquor stores with California Chardonnay, Washington Merlot, and Kentucky Bourbon, while American vintners and distillers counted on their northern neighbor as a steady, high-value market. Ontario alone imported over $700 million worth of U.S. alcohol annually, making Canada one of America's most reliable partners in the global drinks economy. This was more than commerce. It was cultural exchange, with Napa Valley tours marketed directly to Canadian travelers and Canadian whiskey festivals proudly pouring Jack Daniel's alongside Crown Royal. Stability felt guaranteed. But cracks began to appear as trade tensions mounted under the Trump administration. The imposition of steep tariffs on Canadian goods rattled policymakers in Ottawa, and whispers of retaliation grew louder. What once looked like a flourishing two-way street began to resemble a political battleground. Canadian producers complained of unfair disadvantages, while domestic campaigns urged citizens to buy Canadian as a patriotic act. At first, it seemed symbolic, a nudge for shoppers to consider local options. Yet beneath the surface, the calculus was shifting. The seeds of resistance were planted, and the U.S. wine and spirits industry would soon feel the full force of their neighbors' resolve. The fracture began in Washington. In early 2025, the Trump administration doubled down on its protectionist stance, reviving the same aggressive tactics that had defined his first term. Central to this policy was the sweeping use of tariffs, pitched as a way to level the playing field for American workers and punish trading partners deemed to be freeloading off U.S. markets. Canada, despite being America's closest ally and top trading partner, was not spared. Trump announced tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, and even certain agricultural products, branding them as necessary to defend American sovereignty. The move was designed to score political points with U.S. manufacturing workers, but it carried unintended consequences. For the alcohol industry, the shockwaves were immediate. Canadian distributors suddenly faced higher costs, importing everything from machinery parts to bottling equipment sourced from the United States. Industry analysts warned that retaliation was inevitable, but Washington dismissed these concerns. Officials argued that Canada was too dependent on U.S. goods to strike back in any meaningful way. That assumption proved disastrously wrong. Meanwhile, U.S. vintners and distillers, particularly small and mid-sized producers, found themselves caught in the crossfire of policies they hadn't asked for. Many had built their export strategies around the stability of Canadian demand. Napa Valley wineries, for example, had marketing campaigns tailored specifically to Toronto and Vancouver. Bourbon producers in Kentucky relied on Canadian distributors for up to a quarter of their international shipments. These businesses suddenly faced the prospect of losing their single most reliable foreign market. Yet Washington doubled down. The administration's trade office framed the conflict as a necessary sacrifice. Short-term pain for long-term gain, one official insisted, suggesting that lost Canadian sales would be offset by opening new markets in Asia or Europe. But the global wine market is notoriously competitive, dominated by established players like France, Italy, Australia, and Chile. American producers were not equipped to pivot overnight. By treating Canada as expendable collateral in a larger trade war, the U.S. government underestimated both the depth of Canadian resolve and the fragility of its own alcohol export sector. Ottawa's counterpunch was both swift and devastating. Rather than impose tit-for-tat tariffs, which could be bypassed or softened through subsidies, Canada deployed a different weapon: consumer boycott. The country's largest provinces, including Ontario and British Columbia, halted new orders of American-made wines and spirits. According to the Wall Street Journal, exports of U.S. wine to Canada collapsed by 67% in the first half of 2025, erasing roughly $173 million in sales. Whiskey and bourbon producers fared no better. Spirits exports plunged 62%, down to just $43.4 million. This was not an accidental ripple, but a coordinated campaign. Canadian officials, alongside industry groups, launched promotional drives like the List, a tongue-in-cheek marketing push encouraging consumers to choose Canadian vintages and brews over their southern competitors. Billboards and social media ads framed buying local as an act of patriotism. Every bottle of Canadian wine purchased was a dollar kept at home. Every case of American bourbon rejected was a stand against foreign bullying. For a public already uneasy about Trump's rhetoric, the message struck a chord. The impact on U.S. producers was brutal. Brown-Forman, the maker of Jack Daniel's, called the boycott worse than a tariff because it didn't just make their products more expensive, it erased them from the shelves altogether. Mid-sized companies like Sagamore Spirit in Maryland reported losing 10% of their export revenue virtually overnight, scrapping multi-million-dollar marketing campaigns and scaling back production. Family-owned wineries in California faced similar fates. Hope Family Wines admitted that Canada's withdrawal cost them 10% of their overall sales, a staggering blow for an operation already facing rising costs at home. Beyond the numbers, the human cost became visible in communities tied to the alcohol trade. In Napa Valley, warehouses stocked with unsold cases sat idle, and seasonal workers were laid off. In Kentucky's Bourbon Belt, local tourism operators reported sharp declines in Canadian visitors, who once flocked to distillery tours. Canada's boycott had achieved something a tariff could not. It severed trust, redirecting Canadian buyers toward France's Bordeaux, Australia's Shiraz, and Chile's Cabernet Sauvignon. These new supply chains, once established, would be difficult to reverse. The boycott wasn't just retaliation, it was a realignment of trade. Both nations now find themselves locked in an uncomfortable standoff. For the United States, the tariffs were meant to project strength, but they have instead exposed the vulnerability of industries far removed from steel or aluminum. Producers who once viewed Canada as an unshakable partner are now scrambling to salvage contracts elsewhere, often at steep discounts. For Canada, the boycott has boosted domestic pride and offered breathing room for local producers, but it comes at a cost. Fewer choices on store shelves and the risk of escalating tensions with its largest trading partner. Neither side has an easy off-ramp. Rolling back tariffs could be seen as political weakness in Washington. Ending the boycott without concessions would appear as surrender in Ottawa. What began as a tactical skirmish has hardened into a test of national pride. The result is a stalemate where both economies absorb damage, and the once seamless flow of wine and whiskey across North America looks uncertain for the first time in decades. For Canadian communities, the boycott was a political statement, but not without sacrifice. Liquor Control Board of Ontario, LCBO shelves that once carried rows of California Chardonnay and Kentucky bourbon now lean heavily on Canadian brands. While this shift pleased local wineries in Niagara and distilleries in Alberta, it also created ripple effects that weren't universally positive. Import distributors lost major contracts, trucking companies with refrigerated fleets saw schedules evaporate, and warehouse operators were left with empty facilities. In Ontario, a logistics company that had relied on weekly shipments from American suppliers laid off nearly 80 workers in early summer. Managers admitted the boycott boosted domestic pride, but wrecked their balance sheet. Restaurants in Toronto reported difficulties sourcing premium American wines that paired with high-end menus, forcing chefs to adjust their offerings. For consumers, the choice to buy Canadian meant supporting local jobs, but it also meant higher prices on certain substitutes. The patriotic campaign resonated, yet underneath, Canada bore the weight of reduced variety and the strain on industries caught between politics and public sentiment. Even as local producers gained a temporary edge, the broader supply chain absorbed deep scars. Across the border, the backlash hit even harder. For U.S. producers, Canada wasn't just another market, it was the market. Ontario alone accounted for more than $700 million in annual sales, and the sudden evaporation of that demand left American businesses reeling. Napa Valley winemakers described pallets of grapes left to wither on vines, sold off at fire sale prices to bulk juice manufacturers. What had been premium Cabernet destined for Toronto's fine dining scene ended up bottled as discount table wine. The damage extended beyond producers. In Kentucky, bourbon's heartland, distilleries that depended on Canadian visitors for tasting tours saw tourism plummet. One local innkeeper reported a 40% drop in bookings compared to the previous summer. Jack Daniel's maker, Brown-Forman, went public with warnings that the boycott was worse than a tariff, because unlike duties that could be absorbed or offset, this was outright exclusion from the shelves. Small-scale players suffered most. Sagamore Spirit in Maryland lost 10% of its overall revenue, roughly $2 million, in the span of months. The company shelved its marketing campaign and scaled back production shifts, sending dozens of workers home. For family wineries like Hope Family Wines in California, Canada's withdrawal erased a decade of relationship building. Instead of diversifying markets, they were forced into retreat. The message was clear. The U.S. industry had underestimated its reliance on Canadian demand, and the cost of that miscalculation was staggering. North America now stands at an uneasy crossroads. Canada has proven that boycotts can bite harder than tariffs, while the United States faces the fallout of policies meant to project strength, but which instead exposed fragility. Trust has frayed, supply chains have splintered, and consumers on both sides of the border feel the strain. The question that lingers is unavoidable. In the race to shape the future, will North America win together or fail apart when trying to go it alone? You are American or Canadian? Share your story and perspective in the comments below.